A fantasy Persona game. That's the back of a napkin pitched for Metaphor ReFantazio, the upcoming Atlus RPG that blends the key mechanics from the Persona games with a novel fantasy setting, but Metaphor marries this with an expanded scope, situating its lengthy story campaign within a semi-open world game structure. That could spell trouble for Atlus, who haven't necessarily been known for technical prowess over recent years. So does Metaphor's bigger scope mean bigger problems? And is the underlying game a worthy fantasy offshoot from the Persona titles?
Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by MSI's range of next-generation QD-OLED monitors, available in 32 and 27-inch 16:9 configurations, along with ultra-wide 32:9 49-inch and 21:9 34-inch models. These are some of the best monitors we've ever tested, with incredible motion clarity, HDR True Black 400 support, OLED burn-in protection, AI features and genuinely game-changing performance. Check the video description to learn more, and for UK viewers, a chance to win an MSI 27QRX QD-OLED, a Metaphor ReFantazio PC and Xbox game code, and exclusive tote bag.
I think it's best to start with what Metaphor ReFantazio does well, because its visual presentation can be striking at times. In signature Atlus fashion, its UI design is an absolute highlight. Menus combine carefully illustrated 2D character art with bold splashes of paint texture, and iconography that recalls the Renaissance era of human scientific exploration. This is best appreciated in the game's main menu, which highlights shifting paintings of the main character sandwiched between background and foreground paint splash elements, which are used to highlight text. The main font is an Industrial Revolution era serif typeface that emphasizes visual contrast between thick and thin lines. Text is intersected with ragged straight and circular marks that suggest a kind of older scientific or engineering illustration. Plus, the game has a bit of an obsession with clocks and the passage of time, which is perhaps fitting for a game that revolves around a calendar. I think the ultimate effect produces something quite visually striking that fits with the game's themes. And the game's menus are pretty easy to read and navigate despite all of this apparent visual complexity. The transitions between menu panels are well executed too and have a nice sense of motion. It's somewhat reminiscent of the recent Persona games, but it takes visual inspiration from very different places and uses a lot more texture and color variety. Plus, it makes much more minimal use of real-time 3D elements than Persona 3 Reload or the recent Persona 5 spin-offs, so it's more in line with Persona 5 itself in that respect. It's definitely more similar to those titles than other recent Atlus fare, like Soul Hackers 2 or Shin Megami Tensei 5, which had appealing UI designs but look much more basic in comparison. Like the Persona games, Metaphor tells a long and detailed story, which I think is presented quite effectively. A roughly 80-hour runtime obviously doesn't lend itself to the kind of per-scene production values that you might be used to seeing in some other RPGs, so there are a lot of relatively basic dialogue scenes which are often voiced. These scenes have effective framing, decent looped animations, and striking animated portraits to convey emotional states. But Metaphor features a lot of higher production budget scenes too, including lengthy fully animated 3D cutscenes, which often depict pivotal action moments that wouldn't really work as little dialogue dioramas. And the game has quite a lot of 2D anime cutscenes as well, which are sprinkled liberally throughout the story for key plot developments. This is a big improvement over other recent Atlus fare like Persona 3 Reload, where these more demanding animated sequences were used more sparingly. Judging from my play so far, I'd say Metaphor has a high density of these sequences compared to other lengthy Atlus RPGs, which helps to propel the story and keeps things interesting for players. I think the combat sequences are also quite compelling. I love how the UI works in these sequences, in particular the transitions between menu layouts. Combat animation and spell effects also prove quite satisfying, with camera shake and bold damage numbers highlighting each attack. Most of your time in a turn-based RPG will be spent looking at interface elements, and Metaphor makes these uniquely eye-catching and fun to watch. One thing you may notice here is that the typical roster of SMT and Persona enemies hasn't simply been reused here. A lot of Atlus RPGs since 2016's Persona 5 have substantially repeated that game's set of enemies and enemy animations, with new additions and bosses sprinkled in for each entry. But here Atlus seems to feature all new enemies instead, which tend to have more realistic and intricate designs. Metaphor also does a pretty credible job of representing a larger world relative to Atlus's prior efforts. It's not quite an open world game, I'd say, as the gameplay spaces are still broken into chunks, but some areas can be substantial. Market areas have plenty of NPCs milling about, with the game sometimes rendering hundreds of characters at a time, and draw distances are generous. 2D backdrops are not that common anymore, with city areas and dialogue sequences generally framed with full 3D art, though there's the occasional painting in the mix at times as well. The dungeons are meaty and have some interesting areas, though perhaps Persona 5 was a little more visually striking in its palace areas. Metaphor has a bit of a tougher ask though, as it needs to remain more firmly planted within a fantasy setting, and within that context I think the art looks pretty good. Metaphor ReFantazio does take a step up from Persona 5 in that the baseline target platform has moved from the PS3 console to the PS4, and we see an attendant increase in the complexity of the game's environments. Metaphor probably won't be winning any awards for asset complexity, but there's definitely a greater level of polygonal definition in the environmental artwork. There's a good amount of geometric detail in this wall, for instance, which would probably have been relatively flat before, with maybe a normal map to catch the light. It's also a considerable step beyond what Atlus achieved in Persona 3 Reload earlier this year, which had strangely stark environmental art. I also think the lighting in Metaphor can be pretty good as well. I don't want to give Atlus too much credit here, as the actual open world lighting can look quite flat in indirectly lit areas, but smaller scale areas do exhibit higher quality baked lighting, and there are some nice post-process touches like SSAO and a very Persona 5-like bloom lighting effect. I'd say the game's lighting and texture art are in general quite reminiscent of that earlier Atlus effort, which is perhaps not a surprise given that the game is actually running on the Persona 5 engine. Metaphor is definitely not up to current gen lighting standards, or even necessarily the quality of a more sophisticated last gen game, but the lighting quality overall is satisfactory enough in a lot of places. And even where it isn't, the use of higher frequency texture art helps to break up the image in a way that makes any faults less visually obvious than in a game like Persona 3 Reload. Finally, I'd say the game looks reasonably visually cohesive. There are some stylistic shifts between the various ways the game is presented. Shadows, for instance, have textural patterns in the 3D cutscenes, which isn't true elsewhere in the game, and there's an obvious contrast between the painted portraits and cel-shaded rendered graphics. But overall, I think it looks cohesive enough, and the real-time graphics blend well with the UI and 2D art. Metaphor ReFantazio has some pretty large visual faults, and I suspect these issues will have a tendency to stick with players. Firstly, the game's overall level of rendering tech is still reminiscent of what we'd see from a PS3 era title. This should be clear enough from the footage you've seen so far, but we're obviously not getting the sophisticated baked GI, PBR, and TAA that defined PS4 and Xbox One efforts. Never mind the ray trace lighting that is increasingly characterizing the current gen. Instead, Metaphor is marked by harsh shadow maps, normal maps, and specularity, a visual mix that came together on 7th gen machinery like the PS3 and Xbox 360. It's not necessarily an unappetizing mix, but it does give the game a bit of a dated feel. It's somewhat reminiscent of some early 8th gen games from about a decade ago, which combined higher art budgets with more primitive rendering techniques. But the art isn't uniformly high quality either, and we do see some areas where the 2D assets are a little bit questionable. Level geometry is fine enough for the most part, but textures are sometimes a little flat and muddy. There are some curious issues with video as well, like how the video capture used in the title screen appears very low quality. Anime cutscenes also appear a little bit soft and can look overly compressed at times. The next two issues, though, are perhaps the largest, and might end up defining the visuals here for the worse. Metaphor has relatively poor image quality, with a lot of aliasing and shimmer at all times. Like Persona 5 on consoles, there's no anti-aliasing whatsoever, but critically here the geometric density of the game has seen a big bump, providing more fodder for aliasing artifacts. Combine that with a high contrast art style that uses outline shaders, and the game is just an aliasing mess. The footage we've been showing so far comes from the PS5, where the game renders at roughly 1656p, so resolution isn't really the issue, I'd say. Image detail looks fine enough from a normal viewing distance, and the game seems reasonably sharp. It's just the presentation of aliasing that annoys, and that's something that only a temporal AA technique could really fix, though getting that working properly with the existing engine tech here would likely be a reach. To contrast, the PC version of the game runs pretty well at native 4K here at high refresh rates on my RTX 4090 based system, but it doesn't actually look much cleaner at all. It seems like the size of some of the outlines scales with rendering resolution on PC as well, which means that you do lose a bit of visual stylization as you step up the res, and the finer lines tend to shimmer obviously. It takes a full 8K downsampled to 4K to approach decent image quality, and that often drives performance below 60 FPS even on a 4090. These brute force approaches just aren't going to work for console hardware, so it's a bit of a TAA or bust situation for image quality in this title, I think. Plus, performance isn't very good. On PS5, the game basically operates at an unstable 60 FPS, with frame rates in the low 40s at worst. Some areas play back mostly at 60, like the second city, while most areas in the first city cause substantial performance issues. Combat tends to run poorly as well, and strangely, some of the more enclosed dungeon and interior spaces also tend to run well below 60 frames per second. Real-time cutscenes can also see prolonged drops, though the 2D anime sequences appear to be encoded at a straight 30 FPS. That's a bit odd for a game that looks like this and is running at a moderate resolution already on PS5 consoles. I definitely get the sense that the game is primarily GPU limited here, as panning the camera towards the sky gets us back to a 60 FPS lock, even when traversing at speed. There is some slightly weird behavior going on with the game in general though. Despite having a pretty wide scope, I don't think there's a good level of detail system here. I never noticed pop-in on models in-game outside of the use of stylized imposters for distant characters. I'm also not sure how effective the culling system is so that objects not seen by the player aren't drawn. I can position the camera such that I'm essentially facing a wall and can still get a large performance hit, as long as the area behind that wall contains a complex scene. Most game engines do a good job of keeping out of view and distant detail under control, but the Persona 5 engine might not, at least in this game. Persona 5 does run pretty well on current-gen consoles using this same game engine, hitting 4K 60 on PS5 and Series X, though it's a much simpler game that tends to have pretty basic environments in comparison. But perhaps the better point of comparison is the PS4 Pro version of Metaphor, running under backwards compatibility on PS5. Here the game runs just about at a locked 60 FPS in the content I tested, including busy city areas, but struggled consistently on PS5. Critically, resolution gets a big cut here, going from roughly 1656p on PS5 to 1080p running the PS4 code. Imposters are also used at a closer distance from the camera, shadow map resolution takes a substantial hit, and some texture assets appear especially low resolution. The UI is also rendered at 1080p, which doesn't look great compared to the 4K UI of the native PS5 version. But that performance level critically is much higher, and presumably some of these compromises wouldn't be necessary for a native PS5 version to maintain 60 FPS. But there is one little wrinkle here, and that's 120Hz support in VRR. Strangely, Metaphor ReFantazio does support 120Hz output on PS5, as when you start the game with 120Hz enabled in the system settings, the game boots at 120Hz output, with the frame rate unlocked so it can go above 60 FPS. Visual settings appear to be identical, so this is a pure frame rate unlock here. That means that in identical content, we get an essentially identical overall frame rate, as we see here in the opening of the game. It also means that most of the time in reasonably complex areas, we are below 60 FPS, but if we turn our sights to the sky, something like 70 FPS or even 80 FPS is achievable. Unfortunately, Atlus hasn't also implemented VRR support explicitly, and forcing VRR on in the system settings doesn't force low framerate compensation, unlike some other titles that run at 120Hz with VRR. That means that the game is going to feel pretty bad when the framerate dips below 48 FPS with VRR enabled, regardless of whether you have the game at 60Hz output or 120Hz output. 120Hz LFC would definitely be one way to help, though not solve, the inconsistency issue, though I'd prefer the game just ran at a more consistent 60 to begin with. Even with VRR on at the moment, I'd rather use 60Hz output here just to keep inconsistency to a minimum. The nuclear option may just be to wait a month for PS5 Pro, where the 45% GPU bump would likely just about lock the game to 60 FPS. This assumes the game has PS5 Pro support and that Atlus doesn't do something poorly considered, like forcing higher res rendering. If the Ultra Boost mode deploys the full force of the Pro GPU to older software, that may be enough as well. Unfortunately, we weren't sampled Xbox code for this review, so I can't fully address performance and visuals on Xbox Series consoles, but we do have a lengthy playable demo that in my experience on PS5 corresponds closely with the full game, so I did take a quick look at that code. On Series X, we get a very similar visual experience to PS5. Graphics settings appear identical, with the same 1656p resolution, combined with similar shadows and imposters. Performance is again similar to PS5, with a variable framerate that dips into the 40s, but can hit 60 in lighter content. 120Hz unlocks the framerate, and if we look right up at the sky, we can hit substantially higher FPS figures. Series S predictably takes the resolution cut all the way down to 1080p. That also affects the UI, which goes from 4K on Series X and PS5 down to 1080p on the S. Other visual settings look pretty similar, except that shadow draw occurs at a closer range on Microsoft's Junior console. Performance is notably degraded compared to Series X and PS5, with frame rates sometimes dipping into the 30s, and 120Hz output again unlocks the frame rate as you can see here. Both Xbox systems behave about as you'd expect, but there is one wrinkle. It seems that there may be an issue with VRR in this title on Xbox Series X, as the game has obvious stutter when panning the camera when it drops below 60 FPS or 120 FPS, depending on the maximum output refresh rate. LFC is definitely active here at 120Hz, as you'd expect on Xbox, but it doesn't seem to fix this specific issue. PS5 and Series S seem fine, or at least seem less affected. As with everything I've said about Xbox though, I don't know whether this will persist for the full game. I quite enjoyed my time with Metaphor ReFantazio. The game is going to attract a lot of Persona comparisons, and that's for good reason. This is the most Persona-like of all the games that Atlus has produced outside of the Persona series itself. There are so many similarities that it would take a video of its own to describe them, but it has very similar time management, social links, turn-based weakness-oriented combat, party-based gameplay, items and equipment, and dungeon layouts and mechanics. Virtually everything in Persona has a direct analog here, and if you're used to Persona, this game will feel pretty familiar from the get-go. But there are some interesting tweaks and alterations that make this game feel unique. Metaphor features some real-time combat elements in probably its biggest gameplay break from the Persona titles. You have a few basic moves here with the aim to disrupt more powerful enemies before taking them on in turn-based fights or to simply blow away weaker ones. It feels like a polished, well-thought-out expansion of the sneak attack system from prior Persona entries. Exploiting weaknesses no longer provides an extra move for the current character, instead providing an extra move for your party. So weakness attacks can't be chained and aren't as strong, and special moves aren't random, or something that fills up over time, but instead require you to use up multiple turn slots. The character progression is totally different too, as characters are able to adopt class-like archetypes that govern progression, and each character is free to become a different archetype as the player pleases. These mechanics make the game a bit more flexible and ultimately provide more depth, as the path to win in any given combat encounter often isn't as clear. It's a truly excellent game and will definitely satisfy people looking for another Persona-style effort. The game is framed a little bit more conventionally though, focusing more on a wider overarching story than on smaller character narratives. The game's companion system, a direct analog for the social links in Persona, isn't quite as fleshed out in my play so far, though that could develop further with more gameplay. I also really enjoyed the music, which feels very Persona-like despite its more orchestral style. I'm definitely eager to play more of this game though in my personal time in the future. I'm just not sure where to play it, if I should continue on PS5 or on the PS4 Pro code on PS5, wait for PS5 Pro, or restart it on PC or Xbox. It's very much contingent on how Atlus develops the game further through post-release patches, and especially dependent on how the game works on PS5 Pro. Metaphor has major performance compromises, and we really do need to see those issues addressed. If I had a few Persona 5 style requests for Atlus to fulfill on current-gen consoles, they'd be to add a mode that caps the game at 30 FPS, to add a mode that reduces resolution to hit a more stable 60 FPS, to not increase resolution on PS5 Pro, or to keep a resolution boost optional, so that the additional power on PS5 Pro can hopefully bring the game to a much more stable 60 FPS frame rate, and to add low frame rate compensation support for 120Hz output with VRR on PS5, at least if the first two items aren't implemented or aren't successful. I think expecting Metaphor's basic visual faults to be fixed post-release is probably a little bit unrealistic, but changing the game configuration to work better at more consistent frame rates would be welcome. In particular, I really don't like that the PS4 code runs so much better on PS5 than the actual native PS5 version. At the moment, I can't wholeheartedly recommend any console version of the game, though a cursory look suggests the PC release might be a solid choice if you have higher-end hardware. That said, the PS5 version with VRR is probably the best combination of image quality and performance at the moment on consoles, given that it's usually above 48 FPS. But I still think Metaphor ReFantazio is very much worth playing if you enjoy, or think you'd enjoy, Persona-style games, as I think Atlus's latest RPG is quite excellent. It's just that to best enjoy it, you need to carefully navigate a range of platform and display choices, each of which come with their own trade-offs. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.